I think it is absolutely important to do experimental, field experimental interventions based big kinds of studies. Now, you will say, I don't have the $1 million to actually do that, okay? And quite frankly, my best work has been done with the World Bank, and it was expensive kinds of studies, okay? The problem is the nice part is that you can also do at least pilot studies with a smaller amount of participants, where you can actually also see where you're right and where you're wrong, and in which direction you're right and wrong. And so that's why I think it is really extremely useful to continue, even on a small scale, to start on a small scale. And I will tell you how I started actually, on a very small scale, with studies. And I did a lot of pilot studies before I then sort of got also the amount of money that I needed to do the kinds of big studies with more than 1,000 participants and things like that. Now, my personal take on the experimental studies that I have done is poverty reduction. So I was interested to understand how entrepreneurship can contribute to poverty reduction. That's the theme. Of course, I've never done a study on poverty reduction per se. I've always done studies on individual entrepreneurs and how to make them better entrepreneurs. Fortunately, some of the economists I have been working with have actually looked at whether there's a displacement effect. You know, you teach some people and then they displace other people. So you teach some people all the tricks in entrepreneurship, and then they outcompete everyone else. And then in the end, you have a zero-sum game. Yeah? Unfortunately, that's not the case. As a matter of fact, what these economists have shown is that it actually increases the area's knowledge and entrepreneurial activities if you do, if you actually train a part of the entrepreneurs in an area. So rather than that it is a displacement effect, there's a spillover effect that you can see, and that there's a development of wealth in developing countries. So I was very much interested in Africa. I've been a lot in Africa. I'm a visiting professor in Uganda, and I've always been interested to understand what it is in Africa that I can participate in and do something useful. However, quite frankly, I hate it when people just throw the sort of the latest idea that they have into a developing country and say, hey, I have a good idea, let's do that. Or, you know, the worst kind of thing, I once was sitting next to a really, really nice lady in the airplane to Uganda. She told me that she did an intervention, and she even did a study, and I tell you what she did. She had absolutely useless pills in masses in her suitcase. And she said, these pills will help against HIV. You know, and I was thinking, so what should I say? What should I say to this person? And so the first thing I said, of course, why are you doing that? And she said, I want to help. You know. And this is very important to help. I know that HIV is very strong. It was some years ago, 2008, I think, where HIV was still increasing quite dramatically in Africa. And so I can help. I know, because I personally have had so many good experiences with these pills. Okay. And then I said, so did you do an evaluation of those? I mean, do you know that they actually work? And she said, yeah, I do. Because I can tell you at least 5 cases where people have become better. And I would have loved to throw out of the window, to quite frankly, because it is so irresponsible. Now, what I want to say with that is we have to be very careful that whatever we're doing, we are pretty sure that it actually does work. if you do a larger scale intervention. Now, obviously, how to know that it actually does work, you need to do a few things beforehand. No? And what you have to do beforehand is that you have to look, and I'm going to go very quickly across a few things, and I come back to them, okay? What you have to do is you have to do a whole lot of sort of studies that look at first, of course, simple correlational studies, then maybe longitudinal studies, where you look at what is the focus of what you're interested in. And then once you know that it actually is correlated, maybe you can actually show in longitudinal studies that there's an increment in the area in which you want to intervene, then you should start with pilot studies to intervene. And once you have done that, then you can actually do a bigger study of intervention and ask for the money to get that done. And of course, people who will give you money or will give you lots of money will want to know that you can already do this well enough. So the question then is, how do you go about it? Now, we are typically theory-oriented, and I'm not absolutely certain that's a good idea, actually, quite frankly, because there are essentially two ways of doing interventions. One way to do an intervention is to say, what is the phenomenon that I want to intervene on? And what do I want to achieve? You know, and so I said I want to achieve that people become better entrepreneurs. So I could, of course, say, so let me think of what the literature in general says, you know, what do good entrepreneurs do? And then the second thing is I look at the phenomenon, that particular phenomenon that I'm interested in, let's say micro-entrepreneurs in Africa with 1 or 2 employees, and I look at them and I look whether this is sort of verified what I know from the literature. And I would also ask questions, you know, what do you really need? You know, you would do a needs analysis and you would say, you need these kinds of things. You need, for example, a lot more knowledge in supply chain. That's a big term to just mean how do you get your supplies cheaper? Or you will say, oh, they don't have much refrigeration, so there's an issue of where they store things. So let's talk about how storage is done and in which way you can actually do that better, because you also have to invest capital, and of course capital is very scarce. So how do you know better how to manage your storage, etc.? So these kinds of things you could ask, and people will be ready to tell you, and they will be very good to tell you. The problem is, unfortunately, that often enough they don't know what they really need, unfortunately. So they will not know in the sense. They will know at the end of a training that it was what they needed. That they will know. But they won't be able to describe what they really need. Okay? And I will tell you actually in the story that I elaborate that this kinds of needs analysis may lead you astray as well. So it's not the only way to go about it. The other way, of course, to go about it is not to do a needs analysis, but to say, I want to zero in on something where I'm quite knowledgeable about, for example, on Higgins' theory of regulatory focus. And then since I know this is really important, and since I have evidence that it's really important, I want to focus on that part, okay? That is also possible. I would urge you, though, to do pilot studies and to test it maybe against some other alternatives that are around that may have a different take on the same thing. Yeah? Let's say Dweck's theory, for example. So, yeah.
Share slides with the participants.
I know, but I'm only talking about this one still. So the next point is, once you have a theory, and of course sometimes you have several theories, sometimes you have one theory, you have to translate that theory into practical. And actually, I think people haven't been thinking about that a lot. And I think it's actually quite an interesting issue. How can you actually make theories practically useful? And my hunch is that the best way to do that is via principles of action. Principles of action implies that it is something that is immediately seen as a good rule of thumb by people who you train, and that is formulated in such a way that it is easily, that it is easily understandable. You will also see that actually people don't really understand it, even if they do understand it well, and that they need to be actually trained. So it's not something where you can just teach them, do this or do that, then they immediately pick it up. That is very seldom the case. So most of the time, you probably have to develop these principles of actions. You have to develop these principles of actions into teaching points. You have to use the teaching points then to go further than just talking about this particular teaching point. You have to give examples, you have to give cases, you have to get people to give you examples, you have to correct them, and you have to discuss them, what that means. So, and then once you have all of that done, you need to do a randomized controlled group design. Now let me tell you that I have done everything wrong under the sun before I did randomized controlled group design. So for example, I did a study in South Africa with a master's student, and we had participants in South Africa. These were micro entrepreneurs, so it was the focus was on the right thing. So had a nice training developed, and we thought that was a really nice training. Anyhow, on personal initiative, I tell you in a second a bit more about it. And then we had about 200 people whose addresses we got through some kind of organization. So those 200 people we interviewed, and at the end of the interview, asked them, would you like to participate in a training? And then some people said yes, and some people said no. And since we didn't really yet have the idea that randomized controlled group design is really important, we sort of said, okay, so those people who said yes, we're going to take, and those people who said no, we are going to have as a control group. No? And of course, quite frankly, sometimes you sort of think, hey, I know that this is a good training, and actually there's an ethical dilemma here. Because it is a good training, you say, hey, I actually want them to get the good training, those people who really want to have it. And you can be damn wrong. Now in this case, we weren't so damn wrong about that, maybe. As it turned out later, we weren't so wrong. But when we tried to actually do this study, we found the following result. Those people who participate in the training started out with a profitability of this. Those people who were in the control group started out with a profitability of this. And they went up, and they went a little up, not much. And we sort of wanted to sell that to journals, and they immediately said, come on, you have a selection effect. You have a just weird selection effect. Come on, you can't do this. This is pure nonsense, okay? Go back and do a real study, okay? And they were very right. That same MA student then did his PhD, and that was our really first good study, okay? As a result of really bad feedback that we got from all sorts of good journals that we would have loved to publish in. So, now don't make that mistake, okay? You don't need to reproduce all the nonsense that I did. Do immediately a randomized controlled group design. Even if you only have 70 participants, in principle, do a randomized controlled group design, because you'll know much more afterwards, okay? So, I'm not happy, of course, with I mean, the power issue is a power problem, of course, so I'm not saying that this is a fantastic study, but it wasn't going to be any good anyhow, if you did it the way we did it. And so better do, in principle, a good design that is underpowered than do a bad design, where you sort of hope that it works. It seemed to work, okay, by the way. And of course, as a generalization study, you can actually use it. So after we did the really good studies, we could say, yeah, but it generalizes. It's also true in South Africa. We did another study in Germany that had a similar problem. And it's another sort of generalization study. So the same kind of thing seems to work in similar ways in different environments and different degrees of development, economic development. Okay, so do a randomized controlled group design. And then the rest is how you want to do and in which way you want to actually advance knowledge in the area that you're interested in. And so let me come back to that. So we were interested in, let me just tell you a stereotype that I have, and this is not readable and you don't need to read it, okay? The point is only there are many, many, many different concepts here, and they all are supposed to work in some ways towards growth and success of entrepreneurs, okay? And actually it's a good model, yeah, I'm proud of it. But of course, you can never ever do it. Particularly, you can never ever intervene on that kind of model. So where do you want to intervene? You don't want to intervene if you are not interested in selection. You don't want to intervene at the personality side. Why? Because personality doesn't change that quickly. No? So you want to intervene at something that is easier to intervene. And what I personally always say is intervene at the point of behavior, because we know we can change behavior. We know that we have difficulties changing personality. It's easy to change values because they usually follow behavior. Yeah? So once you have changed behavior, people also like it, what they're doing. Yeah? So values easy to change. But values don't have a driving force. So it's much better to change the behavior first. Okay? And so try to find the entry points where the behavior, where you know the behavior that you want to foster. Okay? And that's why the principles of actions is also very useful for you, because you now actually have to talk about behavior of actions. Yeah? Rather than talk about you should think this way or that way, because thinking this way or that way is often very easy. I mean, if you think of Dweck's studies, yeah, you can make people think this way or that way within an experimental setting. I can tell you, don't believe that intelligence is fixed, and I can tell you, believe that intelligence is fixed, and then I give you some tasks and give you some tasks, and indeed you are different. Yeah? So that is easily changeable. Yeah? But the problem is you want something much more important to change. You want the behavioral tendencies of this person to change so that it transfers and generalizes into their everyday activities as entrepreneurs. So you need to do something that is both more fundamental, but at the same time more action-oriented. Yeah? Okay? So don't start out with, that would be my strategy, okay? But you don't have to believe me. But don't start out with beliefs, with thoughts, with values, with the kinds of things that is going on in people's heads. Because again and again and again, we have shown that they often follow the behaviors. Yeah? So once you have changed the behavior, then people have different values, different ideas, different concepts, and often different decision trees in their head. Yeah? Because, and it makes perfect sense that they do it that way, because they first have to test things out, whether they can actually trust this kind of new idea that you're trying to put into them. And they need to trust that first by actually doing it, yeah? And seeing whether it works or doesn't work. So it would be crazy of people whose livelihood is completely dependent upon you if you do it in a resource-poor environment. And pretty much every entrepreneurship study is done in a resource-poor environment. It would be pretty crazy for them to just believe you, yeah? Without actually trying it out. Yeah? So therefore, the trying out part is the most important part that you have to influence. And it's the behavior that you have to influence. So this is all, this is then the starting point for personal initiative. Personal initiative is essentially proactive behavior. And it implies three things. The first thing for me is that it implies that you are self-starting, that you do things on your own, which is sort of not so important doesn't seem to be that important for entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs are always doing things on their own. There's nobody who tells them what to do. Yeah? However, we have enlarged that to some extent. We have said self-starting can also be a problem if you just mimic others, okay? Now that is quite frequently in entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs quite frequently mimic or do something very similar to others. Now it's actually a complicated matter. We shouldn't, in and of itself, it's an interesting research question. So how much should you mimic, and it's this big question of, is the first the first user advantage, the first inventor advantage in entrepreneurship. And of course, it makes perfect sense that you ask the question, is it sometimes better to be the second one? Yeah? Because you can already see what has gone wrong with the first one. Yeah? My hunch is that if you do exactly the same thing as the prior person has done, the prior entrepreneur has done, then you're probably not doing that well, okay? So that is not self-starting enough. If you put a little knack on it, if you do something that's a slightly different orientation, that's slightly different, in other words, when you use some kind of creative approach to that mimicking, that's a different issue, okay? I'm not worried about that. But I'm worried about people just doing exactly the same thing that their neighbors do. And I've seen that quite frequently, that people, and you have seen that too, that people have the same products. She is selling whatever, yeah? Let's say these flasks, yeah? And then she is also selling some water, okay? And he says, oh, she is selling water, it makes actually sense, I sell water too. Yeah? And then you have 5 people who are selling flasks and water, okay? Now this is a problem, okay? Because then these 5 people are just competing with each other essentially for the attention of the buyers, and that's not a very good strategy, yeah? So they should use something that differentiates them from the other people around them, which is particularly a problem in more collectivistic societies, like in Africa, but it's also a problem in many other societies. So that's not mimicking is a bit anyhow. So that's the first thing. So self-starting doesn't just mean that I do things myself without somebody telling me. It's also I don't do things because I see other people doing it. I do it slightly different, or I add something to it that is useful. And that's, by the way, the same thing that is asked of you when you write a scientific article. It's the same thing, okay? Absolutely 100% the same thing. The article has to be a little different from the articles that have been done in this area before. Yeah? And that's, of course, the add-on value, and that's exactly what the entrepreneurs need to do as well. So that's self-starting. The second thing is I have to think a little more long-term, future thinking. Now, I can define long-term in a stupid way. I can say you have to think of the next 20, 30 years. Yeah? Fortunately, in Africa, I've never seen that happening. Okay, but there may be in some countries some people who fall into such a trap that they only plan for stupid ideas that might come into effect in 30 years. But you can be a little more long-term oriented than you typically are, and that's the idea of this future orientation. In terms of what are problems that may appear, and I can prepare for them now, and what are opportunities that I can prepare for them now. Yeah. Okay, and the last one is overcoming barriers. Since you're in a competitive environment, there's always barriers, there's always others who underprice you, who mimic you, etc., etc. So you have to overcome barriers. Often you're resource constrained in your activities, etc. So nothing is easy, and you have to deal with two things. Number one is you have to deal with the outside problems that appear, and number two is you have to deal with the inside problems that appear. Your inside problems is your frustration at your own bad decisions that you have made, that your mistakes that you have made, etc., etc. But also the frustration that things are not working out as you actually thought they did, etc., etc. So the frustration, the internal barriers, as well as the external barriers need to be overcome. Now this is my take on it, okay? And this take I thought was useful to understand entrepreneurship in difficult environments. And I think, and we have done that several times, that we showed that indeed it was correlated. It was actually, in a longitudinal study, it actually showed up to be useful longitudinally. And you had a little bit of causality in there. And that's why we started to do experiments on these things. So, any questions up to this point? I'm going to jump across these things now. Did I answer the first one? Why? Enough? I mean, I want to be right, okay? So I want to know that I'm right, okay? That's the major point. And I don't assume that I'm right, okay? So that's the major issue of doing a study where you actually see, hey, this is wrong. It didn't work out that way.
Yeah, so we had a discussion here. So at the one end, we also wrote it down. It's really about causalities, right? So
yeah.
You want to know that you're right, but we also thought it's also very practical. So that's also one of the
policy implications are, of course, much easier to have if you have an intervention than if you don't have an intervention. So you are asking the question. Isn't it also more practical? Yes, it is more practical. You have to do a few things in between to actually use that argument in a decent way. You have to look at mediation effects, for example, and I come to that in a second. Okay. So, any other questions? Very useful.
I'm curious on the intervening at the behavior. Obviously, that's the goal. If behavior is performance or something that was just kind of out there, I'm curious about how do you intervene on things that what are the behaviors that produce that behavior that I'm really interested in long run. So in dealing with that, there's all kinds of thoughts and all kinds of other things that affect that.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you determine in your design, where you're going to try to.
Yeah. So you're asking, Lincoln, you're asking a very, very important question, and that is, there is behavior and there's behavior that follows behavior. Yeah, and for example, so how do you approach the customer? Of course, be determined by other behavior that you're doing beforehand. Yeah? So what I'm saying is, yes, you have to actually put behavior in the foreground, but of course there must be principles behind that behavior. No? But my point is you need to start with the behavior. You need to actually convince people to try out the behavior rather than to sort of believe your principles. That is my point. So, for example, of course, personal initiative to customers may mean something very different in one environment than in another environment. Yeah? So, for example, in many of the environments that I know of, if you, for example, use leaflets, that is an innovation, yeah? Because nobody else uses leaflets to actually tell them that you are having a shoe shop, or that you are having that you're a shoemaker, yeah? And that you're a particularly good shoemaker for whatever. Yeah? So that may be a sign of proactivity in one environment. In another environment, it's nothing. Yeah? It's just also, yeah, it's just mimicking. So we should always look at in which context are you, and then of course that's the principles behind it. So be different from others, yeah, would be then the approach, and then we would discuss it with them, and we would never, by the way, we would never tell people what they should be doing, okay? We would always say, so what would be an example of a proactive approach to customers, for example, yeah? In your environment, and you see fantastic ideas, really great ideas. And again, I have a shoemaker in my head who was looking at all these boots of these guys who are security personnel in this particular African country. And of course, this is a big business, security is a big business everywhere. So he was looking at all the boots, and whenever he saw that this particular company had boots that were relatively worn out, he would go to that company and give them an offer of how to give them new boots, yeah? Or make those old boots new again. Yeah? And I thought that was a much better way of thinking about proactive approach to customers than to just sit in a shop, yeah? And wait for customers to appear. Okay, so now for me, since my theoretic background is one of action theory. Now most of you probably don't know action theory, and don't worry about it. Just read it up. But the point for action theory is to put this action issue in the foreground. And it is also to ask the question, how can you change actions? And in which way can you change action? And there are two approaches that have been sort of fighting with each other on how to change action. One approach has been, I must teach you a model of action. Yeah? So I have to teach you a way to act. And as I said before, I'm a little worried about that, because people will actually not necessarily believe me when I give them a model how to act. The other way is to say, I'm going to let you learn through the actions yourself. It's sort of an action learning approach. Yeah? The problem there is that Lincoln's question isn't answered very well. And that is the question, so what principles are you following when you learn something? Do you just learn to do, I learn how to use this cup. Do you just learn how to use this cup? Do you just learn how to use a cup where there's a little bit of ice in there? Etc. Or is it something, I learn something about cups in general? Yeah? And of course you need to learn something about cups in general, and maybe more than just that, any kind of container that contains liquid in general. Yeah? And so you need to, and that's my point then, you need to go from both approaches. You need to both develop the principles of action as in a way theoretical principles. But you need to also have action learning associated with that. Okay? And that of course implies that as a trainer, you will be much more interventionistic. You will give much more feedback of whether something has been exactly right or not yet exactly right. Yeah? And that would be my preferred approach, quite frankly. Now, I also did a lot of research on training through errors, through mistakes, and find that particularly fascinating also in the area of entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurs are, of course, lay people in every area that they approach. You know, they are not accountants necessarily. They are not that and that and that. They're not sellers, trained sellers of something, etc. They're not tax people. And all of these kinds of things they need to do. And so there's lots of stuff that they do wrong. And so I encourage them to use all of these kinds of things as one way to learn. And I mimic that in the training. Yeah? So whenever something is done wrongly, I explain that quite clearly as a trainer, that this is not the way to do it, and in which way can we now think of how to do it better. Yeah. Okay, so you have to develop action principles, you have to do learning by doing, but you have to also not use blind and mindless action. Yeah? So one of my favorite boogeyman is the trial and error idea. That's the most useless idea, I think, that exists in the world. You know, you just try something out and you learn from it. It makes no sense whatsoever. You have to have an idea of what you're doing beforehand. And that may be a wrong idea, okay? That's okay. But you have to have a hypothesis in your mind. Then we do a lot of exercises. We also use small little cases, you know, half-page cases. We give a lot of feedback. We learn through errors, and we try to routinize these new behavior through the course of the training. Okay? So, now we have been talking about the how. Okay? This is how I now did the question of personal initiative. From an action theory perspective, I say, what is an action made out of? It's made out of goals, made out of an idea that I have about the environment, and I have to learn about the environment in which I'm acting. And then I have to do some planning, and be it just the plan of how do I achieve that goal that I just developed. Now, in this second, or maybe in a few minutes, or maybe in 2 days, or maybe in 6 months. And then I do some kind of monitoring of the execution, and then I get feedback from myself, from the environment, and all of this is much more messy than it's up on the PowerPoint slide. Obviously, there's, you know, we scramble around all of these processes all the time. But then I can use the facets of personal initiative, self-starting, future orientation, and overcoming barriers. I call future orientation proactive, because pro actually in Greek means future active. And then overcoming barriers. And then I use goals, information collection and prognosis, plan and executions, and feedback. And now I have a list of 3 times 4 facets, and now I have to find for each facet cases, the kinds of learning principles or principles of actions, and I have to find good examples for each one of those 12 facets. And this is then what we did. We developed for each case and action principles. We looked at the underlying learning goals to answer Lincoln's question, and this we did for all of these 12 facets. And we had cases for each one. And we had exercises, of course, which are very important. Okay? Yeah. So, now you understand how I did it, okay? I suggest to you that you do something similar, that you ask the question, how do I actually understand these actions better? And how can I translate my theoretical approach into action principles? And how can I make them useful with cases, with exercises, with principles of learning, etc.? Yeah.
Perhaps, Michael, then you could go to each team and then give not
absolutely
broader feedback so
Yeah.
that they can take it to tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Possible.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump across this now very quickly. And this is then what we did. We used this kind of approach, and we did a randomized controlled group design. At first, we did our barefoot randomized controlled group design with a PhD student, so without any money. And he had to pay, of course, his trip to Africa himself because we did not have any money. In Africa, it's cheap to live, so it's always better to be there than in Germany. It was a German PhD student, and he looked at training, and 1 year later, half a year later, he asked a few questions, and then 1 year later, he asked for the success. And this is what we found. We found that indeed, personal initiative training changes personal initiative behaviors, and the person, half a year later, and the personal initiative behaviors then change success rate. And I can go into details, but the important thing is here that we needed to look at this mediation, and the mediation doesn't always work, quite frankly. Yeah? And it doesn't always need to work either. I mean, we shouldn't fetish out of that either. But we should at least try to find what are the processes by which people actually do show success. Yeah? Because that's when we want to look at the effects then later on and use policy ideas, then we need to know the mediation actually quite well. Yeah? Okay, now mediation is a complex question, complex issue. I'm not going to go into how to deal with that mathematically and statistically, but you will all know how to do that, or you will ask somebody who knows how to do that. We have a few success stories, and we published it. And it wasn't so easy to publish it, I will tell you in a bit about that, or after you ask questions. Then we started, after we had this study done, this small little study done, the World Bank became interested in this kind of idea. And the World Bank became interested because they found the following problem. And they only found it after they did the randomized controlled group designs. Number one is they found that microcredits did not work as well as they thought. It's not true that they didn't work at all, but there was a high degree of variability, and often it didn't work at all. And of course, there were more and more reports, particularly from India, that microcredits were taken from different banks. The same person took different microcredits from different banks. They paid back the microcredit in this bank with a microcredit from that bank. So they got a bigger microcredit from the first bank, and they got into debts, and of course suicide cases followed. And this kind of thing they were worried about, that they could not use this approach only, at least. Yeah? And so they became interested in psychology. Whenever economists don't know anymore what to do, then they say, maybe psychology can help us. And that's actually quite true, really true. And it usually does help them. Yeah? Because, of course, psychologists then look much more at the mechanism by which things happen. And and the mechanism may actually be very useful. So they turned to us, and we did large-scale interventions, 1,500 participants in Togo, and it was, and the economists were fantastic in doing the study, and I was only allowed to do the following. I was allowed to teach the trainers how to train the trainer. And the second thing is I was allowed to develop hypotheses, and we had a repertory of hypotheses. I was not allowed to touch the data, at least not in the beginning. They looked at the data, they wanted to see whether this worked or didn't work, okay? And they did the following. They had 3 groups. One group did our training, personal initiative training. One group did training that was a business training. And when I talked just before about needs analysis, that was fantastic. It was precisely what every entrepreneur said they needed. And it wasn't just that they were saying that, they actually developed it that way. They had 42 modules. I forgot now exactly how many it was exactly. And they did a needs analysis with the categories of participants, and they checked which kinds of needs were prevalent in this kind of group, and then they taught those kinds of things, and every one of the people said, this is exactly what we need. And then the personal initiative training was a different type of training. And there we did not ask, what do you need? We taught them personal initiative. So this is then the results. And let's concentrate very quickly on the profits. You can see here personal initiative training. You probably cannot see what this is. Personal initiative training here. No, it's not me. This is the traditional business training. This is the control group. Here you see the weekly profits, personal initiative training, traditional business training, control group. And what you don't see here is that the personal initiative training is significantly different from all the other 2 groups. And the business edge training is not significantly different from the control group. This training has been used with 200,000 people already, by the way. And this was the first evaluation study that they ever did. 200,000 people. And I find that, I don't think that they should now stop it completely, but in a way I find that unethical, because you have 200,000 people, you bring up their hopes, they put in quite a lot of time, and at the end they're as good as before. Yeah? And of course then they get cynical about training, they get cynical about getting support, because they say it doesn't work anyhow. Yeah? So this is not a good strategy. Yeah? You should better test that first. Yeah.
So this is a difficult problem, Michael, because the other alternative is controlled by holding out, right? So what is but then they don't have the placebo effect, the sugar pill effect. So what do you pick as an alternate control?
Right. Now, of course, in this particular case, so you're talking about placebo issues, yeah? So placebo issues are, of course, a big problem, yeah? In any kind of psychological intervention, yeah? Because placebos, of course, is psychological. Yeah? So placebo effects we do typically have on most things, but placebo effects typically go away after a while. Okay, so we have, of course, placebo effects in the medical arena. If somebody has a cold and you give them anything, yeah? You have a placebo effect that they become better slightly faster than the other ones. So the placebo actually makes it slightly faster. You take not aspirin. You take vitamin C, yeah, which is another one of those placebos for a common cold, and you actually become better. You feel better, and then you say, "Hey, it was the vitamin C," and it wasn't the vitamin C, of course. Yeah? It was just the time that your body needed to fight the cold. Yeah? So this is one placebo effect. The other placebo effect, of course, in the training of the type that we're doing is that we say it's a Hawthorne effect. We get people involved. We give them hope. We give them all sorts of experience that was positive. And so they are now going into their activities, not with any better ideas, but simply they tried to do things that they didn't try before, for example. Now, in that case, of course, it helped us tremendously that we did have the business training in this study, because the Hawthorne effect should have been much stronger in the business training, because the business training was exactly what they wanted. Yeah? This is what they really needed, what they subjectively really thought we need. Okay? And it turned out that it wasn't exactly what they really needed. Yeah? They needed much more the kinds of things that we taught them. Yeah? So, of course, we looked at all sorts of mediation effects, and I can't go through the mediators in detail, but let me just tell you, one of the mediators, of course, was personal initiative. Another mediator was innovativeness. A third mediator was enlarging the scope of the products or services that you were offering. Another mediator was business practices. And another mediator that was actually suggested by the business edge training was formalization. Yeah? So they said, oh, we should actually make people to become formalized. These were all informal companies. All the 1,500 were essentially informal. And so they said we should make them more formal, more frequently formal, and it worked. So they became more formal. That was the only effect that was significant that the business edge training had. And it did have also, of course, effects, for example, on using better accounting strategies. Yeah? The problem was that neither formalization nor better accounting strategies were related to better profitability. Yeah? While personal initiative was indeed related to higher profitability, and so was, of course, innovativeness, these kinds of things. Yeah? So the funny thing was that even the business practices, there was a list that the World Bank developed of 22 different business practices. And now, of course, some of them were more in the direction of personal initiative, some were more in the direction of doing accounting. Yeah? But in principle, we affected as many business practices as the business practice-oriented training did, and that's of course due to the fact that we had some principles behind it, yeah? Like try things out, yeah? And
That really helped.
And get feedback.
Because I was thinking you were working on the behavior first, but you're teaching the principles of the performance.
Yeah, but at the same time we were always doing it. So we were always saying, okay, so. Now, we use a case and we say, so what's wrong in this case? What went wrong here? Yeah? And what did you just do? You know, what did you do yesterday? Yeah? In this direction. Yeah? So we always worked on their behavior. Yeah? Okay, so the rest of the story, I think I don't need to tell you. The important thing is here. There are three messages, I think, that you should take away from it. Number one is, it is really quite awful that you do interventions without evaluating them. Yeah? I think that's really irresponsible. Yeah? And we should not allow ourselves to do that. We should not allow others to do that, number one. And it turned out that for females, by the way, there was even a slight uptick into the negative direction, business edge training. So females were actually doing slightly worse after they learned the business edge training. So this was not significant. So I mean, it was just statistically we shouldn't interpret it. But there were a few people who were doing worse. I mean, this is terrible. You train them and they actually suffer. You know. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen in personal initiative training. There's variants, okay? There are, of course, always some people who may do worse after the training as well. You know? But in principle, it wasn't like a whole group, like females were doing slightly worse. So they were all doing very well. The second big issue is try to get as many of the intervening variables, of the mediators, as you think are indicative of your intervention, and measure them. They may, there may be an internal coherence between them, so don't take it too seriously that they may all change in the same direction, and one may be slightly higher than other ones. That you should probably not take too seriously. But in principle, you should measure them to sort of start from that part again, to ask the question, so what do we have to emphasize in our training more? No? And the third part that I wanted to tell you is that you should have a sort of theoretical statement that you translate in principles of actions, and that you then really translate into exceedingly behaviorally oriented, action-oriented interventions at the point of your training and afterwards. Thank you.
So can I ask you to give personal initiative training to the research questions here in terms of the intervention they propose? See how you can get them to think more deeply about the actions they will do. And then you can walk around the six boats in the next 10 minutes to perhaps ask a question or give a comment or a suggestion.
I can?
Yeah.
Sure.
And then that should wrap up the session for this. And then
Is there one burning question that you still have, maybe?
Yes.
Before, yeah. Where you say, hey, I don't believe this or that. By the way, it doesn't always work, okay? I should tell you that as well. We have recently a case where it didn't work, our training. And I can tell you why, I think. Not yet, surely, but...
Yeah. I was thinking regarding the mediators, do you before you run the experiment, did you theorize about all of them, why they should be important, or you just look afterwards like which one are?
We theorized potential mediators beforehand, otherwise we wouldn't have a measure. And then we, of course, tried to measure them. And we also theorized them. In this particular study, it was really done like medical studies. So we actually had a hypothesis repository where we put in the hypothesis so that everyone can see what we had prior as hypothesis. This doesn't mean that we cannot look afterwards anymore. I still believe that the data want to tell us something, okay? I'm not against hawking per se. I'm just against hawking always, yeah? Yeah. Anything else? Then yeah.
Maybe one last question. For my second PhD project, we collected quantitative data in Andhra Pradesh, an Indian state. We asked micro entrepreneurs to fill out surveys. And we really had struggles with our measures and the constructs out there in the literature to adapt them. For example, we had to translate our survey into the local language of Telugu, and they don't have a word, for example, for innovation. So we had to describe it somehow. What are your experiences with collecting quantitative data in this context?
It's amazing how many problems you have. We used the personality measure that was in French. Togo is a French-speaking country. We thought it would really work, and it didn't work one bit, etc. So quite frequently you get these kinds of surprises. And yes, indeed, translation issues are always a problem. I personally don't like filling out questionnaires so much, quite frankly. I prefer interviews that are coded later on, because in interviews the coder decides whether this was exactly, what they meant. In a questionnaire, it's the person himself who fills out the questionnaire who decides whether this is what you mean. In our case, it worked both ways. So the interview was as good as the questionnaire, and that was important for the reviewers. Actually, they wanted it both ways. Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna go and walk around. Can I start with this one because it has so many lines? So this is of course a nice one because it has a clear why women are underrepresented, I guess, in terms of VC funding. Is that correct? Do I read this right? And it's an issue of regulatory focus theory. So I assume that you assume that they should be more promotion focused, or what?
It's not an assumption. We published that, this past spring.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In terms of that context, promotion focus of your responses to questions in the domain of gains is favorable for raising funding specifically.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So this is nice. Did you have something like principles of actions on regulatory focus?
So this has been very helpful in terms of extending this work. What we did in the AMJ paper was we conducted a field study and we coupled it with a controlled experiment. And we found that regulatory focus fully mediated the relationship between gender and the funds raised. But at this point, what we're looking to do with this as an RCT is partner with Techstars and implement some of the action plans that you just outlined. So that was really helpful to randomly assign female founders to regulatory focus training and see if there's a significant lift in their funds raised on demo day, specifically at Techstars locations versus Techstars regular mentorship trainings. That's the idea.
Very good. Yeah, that's a very nice design, obviously. And I think...
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when I was reading your paper and then also looking here, you have a treated group, which matches with what we're looking to do, and then the significant increase over just regular training. In your case, it was the business training. So we have that, but then we're just unsure of what would the control group then be. So if it were 3 different group comparison, then I don't have that. I just have the 2 group comparison.
Is that a statistical question or is it a question of content of the 3 groups?
It would just be how you would design something like this with 3 groups, and if it would need 3 groups, or if it's okay the way it's designed right now with the 2 groups.
In principle, of course, you can always argue that that if you can show that one training is better than the other one, that would also be most likely better than a control group. That is highly likely because we know from thousands of meta-analysis that most trainings have some small positive effect. It's not often the case that you actually get really negative effects. There may be interaction points, and I was alluding to those when I was talking about women entrepreneurs in Africa in this case. So therefore, you don't necessarily have to have a control group. However, to answer the question of Hawthorne effect, it pays off, of course, if you can show that you are also different to a control group, and that then the other training, in this case mentorship or what traditional mentorship training, was maybe slightly better than the control group, and you might want to give feedback to those guys who are doing those kinds of trainings of does it make sense?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and this has been super helpful because it was exactly what we were looking to see how we would implement the actual training, because it's set up as like a half day of training, whereas some of the other training modules are somewhat longer and repeated. But the half day of training is set up very similarly to the plan that you laid out, where it has the principles, and then it has them actually role play these scenarios so that they could put those principles into practice and actually have examples, real world examples, where they go back and forth and then they get feedback, and then they're engaging in repetition, so it's more routinized in terms of how they would respond. So it actually
yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Okay, how to provide training, that is quite clearly described here. You had a baseline. How long how long did you wait until you looked at the effect?
So this effect is right after, so it's incorporated into 6 weeks of training as very late in the training process, and then the DV is taken on the demo day, so very shortly thereafter. So I think there's pros and cons to that, where the pro is that you have the immediate connection between the treated and the DV, the outcome that you're measuring. But then the downside is that we just don't know if these effects are sustained over time in terms of subsequent rounds of funding that they go after and what happens then. So that question is still open as to, whether these effects are long lasting or just immediate.
And actually it turns out to be not long lasting, unfortunately. All trainings have a halfway life of so and so many months or years. So that's one of the problems. Yeah, go ahead.
Michael, we're hitting hard stop. Why don't I invite you to join us for lunch?
No, I cannot, unfortunately. No, I unfortunately have I have an appointment already since half an hour, I noticed.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
If you have questions, I'll collect them and then send you an email with the questions.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh no, oh no. Oh,
I
no.
will send one email. Michael.
Yes, one email.
I will send one email.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's much better.
I see one hand in the back. Answer the last question and then we'll get to lunch.
Yes, you can get copies, but not of all the slides. I put 1,000 in there just so that I would have additional slides in case you ask. So I will produce a version that is that can be sent out. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you again.
Okay.